we begin our report with the Republican Party coalescing around Donald Trump 113 days before the 2024 election. Republicans are in Milwaukee for their nominating convention 2 days after the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. Today, the party made it official on who will sit atop the GOP ticket.
The chair announces that President Donald J. Trump, having received a majority of the votes entitled to be cast at the convention, has been selected as the Republican Party nominee for President of the United States.
The former president selected Ohio Senator JD Vance as his running mate. Vance is a 39-year-old first-term senator, former venture capitalist, and the author of the book Hillbilly Elegy. In 2016, Vance described himself as a, quote, never Trump guy. But while running for office in 2021, he said he regretted criticizing the former president. As a senator, Vance has been a vocal critic of providing military aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, federal authorities have yet to nail down a motive of the gunman who shot at Trump during his rally Saturday in Butler, Pennsylvania. One person was killed. The shooter is also dead. The gunman, identified as 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks, fired from a nearby rooftop with a clear sightline of the stage. Lawmakers have questioned why there was a lapse in security. The House Oversight Committee has scheduled a hearing next Monday with the director of the Secret Service. And in a federal courthouse in Florida, the judge overseeing the classified documents case has dismissed the 40-count indictment against the former president. Judge Eileen Cannon ruled the attorney general improperly appointed special counsel Jack Smith to his role. CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett joins me now from the convention site in Milwaukee. Major, let's start with JD Vance. I'm going to ask you about policy on my second question, but the first question is what the kids call vibes question. Where does JD Vance fit into the Republican Party right now in its incarnation with Donald Trump and in that place you're in right now? How was he received as he walked the floor today?
Received very enthusiastically, John. And for those who want to know how former President Trump orients himself not only to the Make America Great movement, the MAGA movement he set in motion, has solidified throughout the entire Republican Party. Not only how does he think about it now, but how does he think about it in the future? Who is a prospective voice? Who is the next generation to speak to that MAGA movement? Well, the former president answered that quite clearly this afternoon by naming JD Vance as his running mate. JD Vance is viewed by many in the MAGA movement as that next generational leader, someone who not only fights for those positions, does so with a rhetorical flair and a kind of devotion to former President Trump that distinguishes him from many others in the MAGA movement. It also helps enormously that he is geographically aligned with the most important place for the Trump campaign to look for states to take away from President Joe Biden, specifically Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and to keep the solid Republican base in the state of Ohio. JD Vance checks all of those boxes. And to the point that you made in the opening, and I think it's something that the country should think about, and I guarantee you our European allies will think about, this ticket, Trump-Vance, deeply, deeply skeptical about continued U.S. military support and economic support for Ukraine. That will no doubt send tremors through Kyiv, the presidency of Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine, and many European allies who will look to the United States to continue to not just unify Europe, but be the leader in advocating with money and strategic advice how Ukraine can thwart Russia's efforts to subsume that country.
Sticking on policy, give us the nickel tour of JD Vance in terms of his domestic policy and where that fits relative to Trump and just relative to what you think the conversation is going to be about in this election.
The conversation this election will be about inflation, immigration, and regulation. On inflation, JD Vance speaks and does have a history of speaking to the economic uncertainties, the economic difficulties of the upper Midwest of the United States. But inflation is a universal conversation. Republicans downplay job creation. They downplay increases in stock market growth. They downplay GDP growth, all of which outrun the record of former President Trump, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. The one thing they focus on, and JD Vance speaks to this with great gusto, is inflation. The cost of living, not only in the grocery store, but at the gas pump, rent, insurance, and the like. On immigration, JD Vance is exactly where former President Trump is, an aggressive policy to not only secure the border with a border wall, but to initiate the largest deportation of undocumented immigrants in our nation's history. No distance between Vance and Trump there. On regulation, in general, Vance is with the former president on cutting regulations, but there's an area of emphasis that JD Vance has brought to his conversation in the Senate about antitrust matters. And he's there aligned himself with some progressive Democrats about taking a more skeptical view of the market share and the power and the clout of large tech firms. Former President Trump has been much more shy about doing that. And I know from the Trump campaign, they view JD Vance as an entry point to the tech world, not only in terms of support, but financial backing. How that plays out will be interesting in the future.
Final question, Major. What's changed, if anything, about the tone, the response inside the Trump campaign in Milwaukee after Saturday's assassination attempt?
Well, the first impulse was, of course, tremendous relief in the safety of former President Trump surviving that assassination attempt, deep grief for the victims of that shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania. There was an initial sense of maybe looking to blame that shooting on the left or liberals or progressives. That died down rapidly when more was known about the shooter, and there isn't a clear motive or any real strong political connection that Republicans want or can point to. That was replaced, that initial impulse of sort of partisan blame casting, to one of unity and reflection on former President Trump is safe, the Republican Party is unified, and there is a possibility that the Trump campaign believes that the country, not entirely, but some significant up-for-grabs parts of the electorate may be willing this week to give former President Trump, if not a second look, maybe a third or fourth look, and they want to have a message that is appealing to them, more unified, less aggressively partisan. We'll see if that follows through.
Major Garrett from Milwaukee. Good to talk to you, Major. Thank you.